The heavy wooden doors splintered like dry bone under the weight of their fury. I stood at the altar, the cold marble pressing against my back, listening to the roar of 100 angry voices flooding the sanctuary. They were rushing down the center aisle, weapons drawn, faces contorted by a lie they had been fed about me, about our faith. Tariq was leading them, his eyes locked onto mine with a lethal, terrifying certainty. I didn't run. I simply closed my eyes and whispered a final, silent prayer, waiting for the first blow to strike. But the blow never came. Instead, the ancient, dimly lit church was suddenly consumed by a light so absolute, so physically heavy, that it felt like the sun had descended through the vaulted ceiling. The screaming stopped instantly, replaced by the sound of weapons clattering onto the stone floor.
It wasn't always this way. For decades, our small, dust-choked town on the borderlands was a sanctuary of a different kind. A place where the call to prayer from the minaret and the tolling of the church bells simply blended into the rhythm of the valley. We shared the same wells, suffered the same droughts, and buried our dead in the same unforgiving earth. I had watched Tariq grow from a barefoot boy stealing figs from the church garden into a strong, capable man. There was a mutual, unspoken respect. We knew that God, in His infinite mystery, had placed us side by side to learn the hardest lesson of all, how to simply be neighbors in a harsh, unforgiving world. But peace is a fragile structure, easily dismantled by those who profit from the ruins.
The poison arrived not on the wind, but in the whispers of strangers who came to the valley during the lean season. They spoke of betrayals that never happened, of hidden weapon caches in the church undercroft, of curses muttered in Latin against the local crops. It was absurd, but desperation makes men gullible. When the river dried up earlier than anyone could remember, the whispers turned into shouts. Someone needed to be blamed for the cracked earth and the dying livestock. The strangers pointed at the church on the hill. I saw the change in Tariq first. The polite nods turned into averted gazes. The shared tea at the market ceased. A thick, invisible wall of suspicion was being built, brick by poisonous brick, right through the heart of our community.
Fear is a fire that consumes reason, and soon the whole town was burning with it. The few parishioners who still dared to attend Sunday Mass did so under the cover of darkness, their faces hidden, terrified of the reprisal from their own neighbors. Rocks began to find their way through the stained glass windows, leaving jagged holes that let the bitter wind howl through the pews. I found defaced symbols painted on the heavy oak doors. The authorities in the city were too far away, and frankly, they didn't care about a border town eating itself alive. I was completely isolated. The young men of the village, led by a now fully radicalized Tariq, began to patrol the streets at night, carrying torches and a righteous, dangerous anger.
They sent a messenger, a young boy I had baptized years ago, trembling as he handed me a piece of torn paper. The message was simple: leave the valley by sundown, or the church will be cleansed. My superiors in the distant capital urged me to abandon the parish, to save my own life,
They called it a strategic retreat. But how could I abandon the only home I had known? How could I validate their lies by running away like a guilty man in the night? I folded the paper, placed it in my pocket, and walked back to the altar. I lit the candles. I prepared the sacraments. If this was to be my final night in the valley, I would spend it exactly where I was ordained to be, standing in the light, waiting for the dark.
The sun dipped below the jagged peaks, and the valley was plunged into a suffocating blackness. From the bell tower, I watched the torches multiplied like a spreading infection in the village square below. The chanting started low, a rhythmic, guttural sound that vibrated through the ancient stones of the church. They were working themselves into a frenzy, shedding the last remnants of their humanity to become a mob. A mob has no conscience, no memory, and no mercy. At the front of the surging crowd, I could clearly see Tariq. He carried a heavy iron bar, his face illuminated by the twisting flames of a torch. The boy who once asked me questions about the stars was coming to tear down my sanctuary. The sound of them hitting the doors was like thunder inside a drum. The thick oak groaned, the ancient iron hinges screaming in protest against the sheer, violent force of 100 men. I didn't lock the inner doors. There was no point. I stood at the very center of the altar, my hands folded, my breathing remarkably slow. I felt a strange, terrifying peace settle over my shoulders. This was the end of the road. The final crack echoed like a gunshot, and the massive doors burst inward, vomiting a tide of angry men, smoke, and torchlight into the sacred space. They poured down the aisles, overturning wooden pews, their eyes wild with a manufactured hatred. For a split second, as they flooded the sanctuary, there was a hesitation. Perhaps it was the sight of an old, frail man standing completely alone, unarmed, making no move to defend himself. Perhaps the sheer silence of the altar momentarily pierced their rage. I looked directly at Tariq, trying to find the boy I knew beneath the mask of the mob leader. I didn't speak. Words would have been drowned in the ocean of their anger. I merely looked at him with all the sorrow and forgiveness my heart could muster. But the hesitation was fleeting. A shout from the back broke the spell of their shared delusion taking over once more. The final charge began. It was terrifying in its speed. Tariq raised the iron bar above his head, letting out a roar that tore from his throat, the sound of pure, unadulterated violence. He sprinted the last 20 yards up the center aisle, closing the distance between life and death in a heartbeat. The men behind him surged forward like a breaking wave, ready to dismantle the altar stone by stone, ready to erase my existence from their valley. I didn't flinch. I kept my eyes locked on Tariq, bracing for the devastating impact, praying only that it would be quick. He leaped onto the first marble step of the sanctuary, the iron bar swinging downward toward my skull. The sound of the impact never came. Instead, the air itself seemed to shatter. An explosion of absolute, silent, blinding brilliance erupted directly between Tariq and myself. It wasn't fire. It wasn't lightning.
It was a solid wall of pure, crystalline light, radiating a heatless, overwhelming power. Tariq struck it. The heavy iron bar rebounded with a sickening crack, thrown from his hands as if he had struck solid titanium. The force of the light didn't burn, but it carried a physical weight, a majestic, terrifying pressure that instantly dropped Tariq to his knees. The mob behind him slammed into the invisible perimeter of the glow, crashing to the floor, blinded and gasping for air.
The silence that followed was more deafening than the riot. The blinding light slowly faded into a soft, pulsating glow that illuminated the sanctuary. Not a single man was standing. Over 100 angry, violent men were pinned to the cold stone floor, not by force, but by an overwhelming, crushing sense of awe. They had come to destroy an enemy, but they had violently collided with the divine. Within that fading light, there was no figure, no face with wings, only an absolute, undeniable presence that laid bare every lie in their hearts. The weapons, clubs, knives, torches lay scattered across the floor like forgotten toys. The anger was entirely gone, replaced by a profound, trembling terror.
I stepped down from the altar. My legs were trembling, the reality of the miracle slowly seeping into my old bones. I walked among the fallen men. Some were weeping softly, their faces pressed against the cold marble. The presence in the room hadn't spoken a single word, yet the message was universally understood. The hatred they had carried was a foreign sickness, and in the light of absolute truth, it had been burned away, leaving only immense shame. They saw the senselessness of their rage. They realized they had been manipulated into attempting to murder an innocent man, to defile a house of God. The illusion was broken.
I stopped in front of Tariq. He was still kneeling, his chest heaving with silent sobs. He couldn't meet my eyes. He reached out with a trembling hand, expecting judgment, expecting the wrath he had just tried to deliver. Instead, I reached down, grasped his calloused hand, and pulled him to his feet. He was heavier than I remembered. When he finally looked at me, his dark eyes were shattered, completely undone by guilt. "Father," he choked out, his voice cracking, "I am so sorry. We were blind." I didn't give him a sermon. I just pulled him into a frail, tight embrace. In that single action, the war for our valley ended.
The men didn't leave that night. They stayed until the dawn broke over the mountains, but they stayed as penitents. Without a word of instruction, they began to fix what they had broken. They righted the heavy wooden pews. They swept the shattered stained glass from the stone floor. Tariq himself took the heavy iron bar he had intended to use on me and used it to repair the massive hinges of the splintered doors. The strangers who had brought the poison to our town vanished, realizing their grip was broken. We didn't just rebuild the church that morning. We rebuilt the shattered trust between our communities, forging it stronger in the fire of an undeniable miracle. Years have passed since the night the angel stood between us. We never spoke of the light again, not directly. We didn't need to. It was etched into the very foundation of the valley.
Today, when the church bells ring, they harmonize perfectly with the call to prayer from the minaret. They are no longer competing sounds, but a shared symphony of reverence. Tariq is a leader now, a man of profound peace and wisdom. Sometimes I catch him standing quietly at the back of the church, looking at the spot where the light hit the floor. We are different faiths, walking different paths, but we are bound by the absolute certainty that in the end, love is the only impenetrable shield.